Some months ago now on the possibility of being here and asked me what I might do in terms of a 2 or 3 day class. Subject that is announced for this class as our focal point, because the lectureship itself, being built around the book of Genesis, thrusts us into a number of passages which fail to make as much sense to us as they should and could if we are not a people who are deeply familiar with the family life and family customs against which the backdrop of these stories is playing out. Now, at the same time, the pursuit of this subject is of more than just academic interest or of value to make the stories in the book of Genesis and elsewhere in the Old Testament come alive in a special way. I think there is also another very important issue that is everywhere discussed in the church today. For wherever you go, we are struggling with questions surrounding divorce and remarriage. We sometimes approach that subject, and it's not a subject I'm going to deal with, except sometimes approach that question in congregational life as though the only relevant sections of Scripture are to be found in the New Testament. We actually only have 2 statements from Jesus on the subject of divorce and remarriage. There are 5 statements in all, but we have 3 accounts of one conversation and 2 accounts of another. So the 5 accounts boil down really to 2 statements. If you will assess and analyze those statements within their context, you will discover that in both cases, Jesus is talking to people who lived under the law of Moses about how to interpret the law of Moses. In fact, the classic passage, Matthew 19, makes it quite clear that that's the case when the Pharisees ask of Jesus, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? When you worded a question to a teacher or a rabbi in Israel, is it lawful? That's the formula for saying, how do you, as a specialist in the law, interpret this section of the Mosaic Code? They were not asking Jesus, is it eternally right? Is it God's eternal will? What they're saying is, what definition do we put on the terms in Moses at the section that deals with the granting of the bill of divorcement? As a result of the fact that Jesus taught everything he said on divorce and remarriage in a context of people who lived under the law and how they should interpret the law, this means that you cannot divorce the Old Testament from your discussion of divorce and remarriage, because the marital customs and the family customs and the household living customs of the Old Testament are the backdrop against which Jesus is interpreting what the Jews of his day should and should not be doing. The reason I say that is because when we get into the study we're about to embark on, we're going to encounter a lot of things that are sort of shocking to us. We're going to begin to encounter passages in which we find practices going on in godly families that would, in our judgment, be considered immoral. We're going to find in the law of Moses provisions for things that we would consider unrighteous, and yet they are encapsulated within God's law for Israel. What begins to happen when you look at family life and family customs in the Old Testament is you begin to realize how far God was willing to go with people to work with family situations that were not the ideal. He has a clear ideal of what families ought to be. And Jesus makes it clear in Matthew 19 that it's one man, one woman for one life. But when you begin to look at what happened with God, within God's covenant family in the Old Testament and the situations he worked with, we then begin to see a God who has an ideal and a standard that he is very serious about, but a willingness to extend grace and work with situations that fall far short of that standard. And that backdrop becomes very important guidance for us in today's church when we're trying to deal with people whose lives fall short of his standard. Because we sometimes act as though it's the minimum of the standard or nothing. But what emerges when we study family life in the Old Testament is a realization that God holds the standard very seriously, but He works willingly from the standpoint that He's not going to write these people off. Their life may not be exactly everything that He would will, but He does work with them despite their failure to live up to that standard. So what we're going to be saying here has an important bearing on the church in the 1990s, insofar as providing a frame of reference in which we deal with some very difficult passages that we have to interpret in the New Testament and apply to today's church. This is a small group, and most of us know one another well. Therefore, I want to encourage you to let this be as much of a dialogical class as possible. Don't hesitate to break in, ask a question, make a comment. Let's take advantage of the small numbers, and what I'm saying, or if I'm omitting something and you feel like I need to fill in some background, I'll be glad to do that. I'm trying to condense into 3 days here what in some of my series over at the Preston Road School, I take 3 and 4 weeks of lectures just to cover in a summarized way. So there are going to be a lot of details in the background I'm leaving out, and we won't cover all the material, so let's cover thoroughly what we do cover. When we begin to read the book of Genesis, we don't get very far into it until we realize that we are dealing with families that operate far differently from the way we think of family operating today. We run into people like Abraham married to his half-sister. We run into a man like Jacob married to 2 sisters. We run into concubines whose sons are given full inheritance within the family alongside the sons born to the legal wives. We don't get very far, in other words, into Scripture before we realize that we're dealing with people who approach family life with a completely different structure of values, outlooks, and expectations from what we know. It is in that encounter with these different lifestyles that we run into some rather strange passages. Leah bargaining with her sister over some mandrakes. What's going on here? A woman accused of having not been a virgin when her husband married her, turning to her parents to bring out the tokens of her virginity and to spread them before the elders of the city. What on earth is going on here? We start running into these things that cause us to scratch our head and say, wait a minute, would somebody explain this? And it's because their frame of reference for family is so absolutely different from our own. Not that ours is wrong and theirs is right. God, in His structure of family, within that basic structure, has allowed a variety of ways for the relationships called family to go forward. In the same way that when He laid down a constitution for the church in the New Testament, He did so in very generalized ways. So that the way the church here in this place goes about its work is in many ways significantly different from the way we go about the work of the church in Dallas. And that's very different from the way the church goes about its work in Kenya. It's the same general blueprint, but a lot of flexibility underneath that blueprint. The same is true with family. God doesn't have a single blueprint for family. Scripture makes that very obvious. He has a general design for family, but underneath that there are a lot of varieties by which such things as, how do a man and a wife come together in the first place? What causes this union to be formed so that God respects it as one man, one wife? The varieties of things that have to do with my responsibilities is not always the same from one cultural and historical era, even in Scripture, to another. When we talk about family in the early sections of the Old Testament, and we're going to divide this section into 3 pieces. We're going to look at the pre-Israelite family, old Israel, and then we're going to look at Israel as a settled nation, because family changes at each of those stages in the way it's organized and some of the values that drive it. When we are looking at this earliest period of Old Testament history having to do with family, we have to first of all start thinking in terms that are far bigger from what we have in mind when we say, how's your family? I walked in and first thing someone said in the lobby is, how's your family? Now, they were not interested in my great-great-grandfather. And they were not interested in my third cousins. They were interested in me, my wife, and my kids. But in their frame of reference, family encompassed great-great-grandfather and all the cousins because everybody lived together as one clan. What we see with Abraham and with Jacob is typical of family at that period of human history. We're not talking about 4 or 5 people or 10 or 12 people living in a household. We're talking about 75, 100, 200, 300 people living as a collection of household units, moving in mass together. So that the kind of thing that happens when Jacob and his family go down to Egypt is very typical of what would have happened in other families in that world. Family is thought of more nearly as what we would call a clan. And there was at the top of the family the patriarch. And we've used that term religiously so long, we've forgotten what it says etymologically. It says that the ark, the rule, was the rule of the pater, the father. It was not a, let's sit down around the dining table and decide where we're going to go on vacation next year kind of family. The head of that clan made the decisions for that clan. And everybody bowed to that decision. His sons and his grandsons and his great-grandsons fell in line. It was a very small kingdom, if you would. He was a monarch, not necessarily with a territory he controlled, but a population that moved with him. We're still able to study this structure of family quite a bit in some of the remote Bedouin cultures of the mountains of Saudi Arabia today. And as anthropologists and sociologists have begun to study those families, they are still doing things in some of those communities, begin to understand the dynamic. And one dynamic that we begin to understand more fully is, why have family structured this way? Why have family organized this way? For economic survival. What kind of land are we? Much of it very difficult to knock a living out of. And if land is resistant to providing a living, that's why in the Old Testament having lots of children was considered a blessing. Because the key to financial survival was having lots of kids. First of all, a lot of them were going to die. A lot of them were going to die as youngsters. A lot of them were going to die before they were 25 years of age. So you had to start off with a big base to have very many survive to old age to begin with. But the other issue was that if you're doing what Moses was doing with Jethro's herds and moving lots of livestock over far-ranging country to find water and forage, it takes a lot of people to run a structure like that. And so you first of all need lots of hands in order to survive economically. Physically. And roll the dice come. Who's going to protect the livestock, the family treasures, the family households? It's going to be the family. Every able-bodied man and woman fights when the bad guys come. And you need a good-sized family unit. Watch what's happening in Somalia today. You've been following the stories of the food thieves who with machine guns simply come. In a 20th century, we talk of nations in the ancient world. We think of nations in the modern sense, where you have borders and central governments and standing armies. The ancient world had no concept of nation like that. Nations had general boundaries. They had a territory they more or less worked around and through. Sort of like wild animals in Africa having a territory they graze. And they graze this and they graze that and they graze someplace else and they go on. But it wasn't a nation with boundaries. And so there was a great problem with brigandage. There was a great problem with violent types, marauders, raiders. In fact, interestingly enough, you come down to the 9th century A.D. before being a raider was considered being bad. Did you know that? You remember how in the history of our own country, in the early days of this republic, people like Jean Lafitte were heroes? They were pirates, but because they were raiding the Spanish galleons, we gave them safe harborage in Galveston and New Orleans, and when it came time to fight the War of 1812, we were glad to have them on our side. See? We sort of blessed brigandage. Well, that's the way many ancient cultures were. They didn't see any onus. And a bunch of us ganging up and going over here and stealing what we could from somebody else. That was the way you made a living on the desert. And as a result, if you had a family that was moving around with livestock, you needed a lot of hands to defend yourself. And that's why there's a very strong authority structure at the top of this thing. The patriarch was the general. And there was no voting. There was no everybody deciding whether he goes along with the plan or not. You either fell in line or you were out. That's why the law of Moses includes a provision that a father can come to the elders of the tribe and say, this son of mine will not follow orders. And the elders of the tribe can investigate, and if the boy will not, what happens to him? He's stoned to death right there. You don't have freelancers in this kind of society. You don't have people doing their own thing. Your identity is caught up in the group, in the family, in the clan. That's who you are. Now, within this society, one of the things that is interesting is what happens with women. Because when women marry, where do they marry? They tend to marry within the clan. Why would women marry within the clan? Why would they marry cousins and half-brothers? Why would you have the stories like Sarah and Abraham? Why would you have the stories like Rebecca and Isaac? Why would you have the stories like Jacob and Rachel and Leah, where near relatives are marrying one another? Why would you marry within the clan? For one thing, you retain wealth within the clan. Now, let's see how we understand this. How do you become wealthy in this kind of culture? And what form is the wealth in? Primarily livestock. If you're quasi-settled, some croplands. But wealth is primarily determined by what's the number of head that we can work with the hands available. And every time you take a pair of hands out of the clan, and you take her ability to produce more hands out of the clan, you take wealth away from the clan. You take resources away from the clan. It is in the interest for this woman to find a relationship within the clan. That's one thing. What else would motivate women marrying within the clan?
These are the ones you trust. They share the same worship of the same deity, same God.
Okay. There is a shared, let's call it a shared spiritual heritage. Okay. It is very interesting, if you start reading the Old Testament carefully, to find how much these God-fearing, God-worshiping patriarchs still had households tainted with idolatry. Do you remember what Joshua said? He says, will you serve God or the gods your father served on the other side of the river? In the Old Testament, anytime you see a reference to the river, capital, it is a singular river, the Euphrates. It was the river in the ancient world, sort of like what happened in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, this is trivia thrown in, you get this free for your tuition. In the Middle Ages, all the great cities of the Mediterranean dwindled down to nothing. Rome became a town of just a few thousand people, where it had been 1.3 million in its zenith. And the only city that survived as a major city was Constantinople. And so, anywhere in the Mediterranean, you could say Constantinople. And Greek for going to the city was Eastern Poland. And in time, Eastern Poland became corrupted to Istanbul, which is what we know that city as today. Okay? Well, it was the same way in the ancient world. When you spoke of going to the river, it was the Euphrates. That was a Semitic structure, which was a way of referring to the Euphrates. Now then, when you understand that, notice what Joshua is saying. He says, which gods will you serve? Jehovah or of the river? How long ago was that? 600 years probably, at least. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then 400 years in Egypt, and then the wandering in the wilderness, and now the conquest of Canaan. 6 centuries since their fathers served these gods on the other side of the river, and the people responded by saying, oh, we will serve Jehovah. And Joshua said what? Then go back to your tents and get rid of those gods. 600 years into covenant relationship with God, and they were still tainted with paganism. And I tell you, one of the most surprising passages you'll come across anywhere in the Old Testament is when Saul weds his daughter Michal to David so he can have a spy in David's house. And then Michal protects David instead of joining the conspiracy with her father. And on one more occasion, she goes out in the morning and sees that her father has planted men in ambush to kill David as he leaves the house. She comes in and says, my father has sent assassins, slip out the window. And it says that as soon as David was gone, she took the household idol and put it in the bed and put a wig on it and covered it up and told the men he's in bed sick. Every time I come across that, I say, wait a minute. What is this household idol doing in David's house? Where does this thing come from? There's no commentary on it in the text. It's just there. Now, the point I'm making is there were lots of deities that these families got caught up with. And even the most godly of the families tended to have taints of paganism that made its way into some of the network. And so if you stayed within the clan, you tended to stay with people who more nearly shared your spiritual heritage, because you didn't have to go very far outside the clan until you were into all kinds of strange paganism. Okay, that's another reason. Why else would you marry within the clan?
It would be to maintain a certain social standard. Another clan could be going a different direction.
Right, there's the key. Different direction. You see, if you marry another clan in a world made up of people who follow the green grass and the water supplies wherever it goes, once you leave your clan, you may never see your family again. Because your clan may migrate east and that clan may migrate north. And so a mother doesn't want to marry her daughter outside the clan because she wants her to see her own grandchildren. She wants to take care of her great-grandchildren, perhaps, you see. It is not in my interest to let my daughter go outside the clan, because then I am deprived not only of watching her children grow up, but I'm also deprived of something else. The security of what? Of the children. The security of the children, but there's another security issue here too. Yeah, the security of my old age. See? What happens to me when I get old? Who takes care of me? My children take care of me. And if I've let the children get away, there's no one to take care of me in my old age. In an era when we have such social structures to take care of elderly people, we forget how much in the ancient world they were absolutely at the mercy of chance. If they did not have children who cared for them, there was no other institution to do it. It was a terrible thing to be old and infirm with no family in the ancient world. And so a woman wanted to marry within her own clan because She knew that if she lost her husband, the clan would take care of her in a way that she might not be taken care of if she was trying to establish herself in the pecking order in a group of women in another clan. Keep in mind that when she marries into a family, she's not marrying a husband. She's marrying a whole clan. Now then, there are 50 or 60 women she's got to get established in the pecking order with. Okay? And all of them are tied together by blood. And she's the outsider. Just start imagining the social challenges that this woman faces. Now she loses her husband as he defends them against raiders 3 years later. What is her status? Pretty miserable for the rest of her life. And so she wants to stay in a place where there are people who will be there for her even if tragedy befalls her. So for all of these reasons, women tended to marry within the clan. Now, one of the things that happened is that when I married a woman in this clan, say here's clan X over here and I'm out of clan Y, and I decide I want to marry her. See, Isaac's clan and the clan back up in the Euphrates were still related, but they had begun to develop into two separate families. So Isaac goes to them and gets a wife. Later, Jacob goes to them to get a wife. But when Jacob is offered a wife, he didn't go there originally to get a wife. He went there to get away from Esau, you remember. But he got there, and his father-in-law-to-be said, hey, why don't I give you one of my daughters? And Jacob said, I can't take you up on that. Didn't have. He didn't have money. Why does he need money to buy a wife? The dowry, exactly. Why a dowry? If I'm in clan Y and I'm going to marry a woman in clan X and bring her out, what did I just do to the economic potential of clan X? I just diminished their economic potential. I took a child breeding person out of their house, and I'm using this in a crass sense, but that's really the way you have to look at it economically. I take someone who could put more hands in this family out of this household, and I take her own industry out of this household. And therefore the idea developed that if I'm going to come to your clan and take one of your women, you have entitlement to something. And so I bring you a dowry to replace the financial loss that this woman immediately is to your family. And so what happens is Jacob ends up negotiating a deal with his future father-in-law. I'll work 7 years for nothing for you to pay the price for this woman. And the industry I give you in 7 years will replace whatever loss you're going to have when she packs up with me and goes back to Canaan. Then he, of course, ends up spending 14 years working for two. It was a 2-for-1 sale that day. Anyway, as this scenario unfolds, in time, it reverses. When you come to the New Testament, interestingly enough, it's not the husband who takes the dowry to the wife and her family. It is the wife's family that gives a dowry to the husband. But the purpose is altogether different. Now then, you've moved from an era of families that migrate in large clans to settled cities and mercantile and commercial operations. And if I'm marrying my daughter to someone, Bill Free comes along and says, I want to marry your daughter. And I say, okay, I will give you this dowry as part of my blessing of this marriage. Do you know why that was done? Because if he ever divorced her, I got my dowry back. He could not divorce my daughter and put her on the streets unless he repaid me the dowry price. And it became a control over husbands flippantly getting rid of wives. You know, Jesus is dealing with this same problem when he talks about the marriage-divorce issue, that there are men in his day who are just, for whatever reason, getting rid of wives. It was a problem in the ancient world. We're going to see tomorrow when we get into divorce and marriage codes in Moses that the person who had all the control in this was the man. Not only could a woman not divorce her husband under Moses, she couldn't even charge him with adultery. One of the things that comes as a real surprise when you start studying the law of Moses, and rabbinical interpretations of it are consistent with this as well as the straightforward language of Moses. A man, when he committed adultery, did not sin against his wife. See, now that's quite foreign to us. We talk about a man sinning against his wife and commits adultery. That's not an Old Testament provision. You know why it is not a sin against a woman for a man to have a sexual relationships with another woman other than her? Because he can have 2 wives or 3 wives. See? Once you start saying he can have sexual relations with 2 or 3, 4 or 5 women legally under the law, once it can be like a Jacob with 2 wives and several concubines, once you permit that, then his sexual relationships with another woman, you follow me? See how that works? Your whole frame of reference changes. Your terminology changes. And one of the things that you will discover as we really look at the law of Moses on this is how absolutely powerless women fundamentally were in that society against a husband who just chose to be arbitrary, cruel, indifferent, whatever. And Moses builds in a number of bridges to try, or barricades to try to prevent that from getting out of hand. But even then, it was way out of hand by Jesus' day. Well, one of the things they came up with is this concept of the dowry. You marry my daughter, I give you a dowry. And you may not divorce her until I'm repaid the dowry. Then I will take the dowry and I will support her. Now that she's back, it's my responsibility. Your dowry repayment to me will become my basis of support to take care of my daughter that you've just put on the street. In a world in which most people were fairly poor, those kinds of economic provisions were key to the survival of the woman who was at the mercy of things.
Mike, when did that begin to change?
When did it begin to change?
Where the woman's family was bringing...
It's probably changing by the time of the Babylonian captivity. It's hard to pinpoint when it has occurred, but it seems to be underway in some of the indirect references that are there in some of the prophetic passages, that already the concept of the dowry being something the woman brings to the marriage instead of a price she's being paid for. It is fully the case by the time the Babylonian captivity is over, that now, that's the way it is when Jesus comes on the scene. No longer does dowry go from husband to wife's family. It goes from wife's family to husband.
It still exists in many parts of the world.
Many parts of the world, that's still the way it works. Now then, what happens now that we've got this household, let's see what time we got, okay. What happens now we've got this household with several wives in it? If you think that having a plurality of wives is a great idea, you ought to read some of the journals and diaries of some of the Mormon wives. Ever seen the politics you get in a house when you got 2 women trying to rule the same man, and he thinks he's in charge of both of them? Well, it was no different in the ancient world. Once you got several women married to the same man, who sleeps with him? What nights? Just start thinking of the problems you get into. And so the ancient cultures worked out a set of mores by which the relationship sexually between a man and his multiplicity of wives was to be governed. And again, this is one of these things we still find in the Middle Eastern cultures where there are multiplicity of wives. First of all, to put it in the simplest sense, the wives rotated nights with the husbands. There was sort of the equivalent of what in the military we call a watch schedule. You know, you have it tonight, you've got it the next night, and you've got it the next night. A woman was entitled to certain nights. Why would her time with the husband be protected by more? This is again one of these things that is so far from what we have to worry about, we don't even stop to think about it. Yeah.
She had to produce children.
She had to produce children to take care of her in her old age. That's the fundamental bottom line. She had to have children to take care of her in her old age. And if her conjugal rights with that man were not protected so that she could be impregnated, she was wronged. So she had very distinct nights each month that she had the bedroom privileges. The man, on his part, did not have to sleep with her that night. He could refuse to share the bed with her that night. But he could not share the bed with anyone else. Her night could not be preempted by anyone else. And that's what's behind that scene we were talking about a while ago in the negotiation between Rachel and Leah as to who gets to sleep with him tonight. Because what has been happening is that Jacob has not been going in to Leah on the nights it was her night. Part of the struggle between them was when it was her night, he just was celibate. Okay? And she gets in a position where she can obligate him to be with her. Let's go over there and look at that text and study it in the setting of all this. It's in Genesis chapter 30. Let's begin at the first. We're going to spend quite a bit of time in this chapter, perhaps even over into tomorrow, because it's one of the key ones in understanding a lot of this dynamic. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children." Now this is an interesting wrinkle. And we're going to find later that Leah does the same thing with her handmaid. These women become at that moment concubines. What Rachel is doing at this point is giving Jacob a wife. She is not fully the legal wife that Rachel is. But once he has sexual relations with her, she has certain legal protections. She cannot be sold as a slave. Her children cannot be treated as slaves. She is not free yet, but she is also not a slave who can be just disposed of like any other piece of property. He has the responsibility to care for her as long as she lives, as though she were his wife. Now what is being played out here is something that we have discovered in some of the archives of ancient Semitic cultures and recent archaeological discoveries was very commonplace. A woman couldn't have a child, and her physical protection and provision in old age depended upon having a child. How is this woman going to have a child? She will give a handmaid to her husband. He will impregnate that handmaid, and remember that deliveries in those days were done on a birthing stool. Women delivered sitting up, not lying down. And the birthing stool was a stool that a woman sat on that had handles on the side that you could use to pull against, to force the baby out of the womb. And it gave them the advantage of gravity pulling on the baby as well as the strength of their body to push it out. And what the woman who gave this handmaid would do is kneel underneath the woman who was delivering the child with her knees up under the spread legs of the maid so that the child came out on her knees. And in doing that, the child became hers. It was their version of surrogate mothering. It was their version of surrogate mothering. That child now was considered hers, and her child for her husband and her. Now again, he didn't have quite the same rights as if he had been born to her. It's a quasi-child. But I want you to notice how the language of Genesis makes it clear that this will be her child. Listen to what she says. "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children." See, she sees this child as being hers. Isn't that a different idea? That's quite foreign from the way we think of things. So she gave him her handmaid Bilhah as a wife. Notice, as a wife, not just as a bed partner. She now becomes a wife. That the wife has to pay when she gives her handmaid to her husband this way is that she's got to make room for another wife in the family. Because from now on, Bilhah will have nights with the husband. She just increased the watch bill by, by another person, you see. Rachel's going to do the same thing. Bilhah conceived and bore her a son. Then Rachel said, God has vindicated me and has indeed heard my voice and has given me a son. Therefore she named him Dan. Listen to Rachel, what Rachel says. She says, God has vindicated me and given me a son. And Bilhah doesn't name the child. Rachel names the child. Called him Dan. I said a while ago, we're going to get into some attitudes and outlooks toward family that are a lot different from anything we know. But you begin to understand why they do these things. It's not only important to know that they did them. Why did they do them? They seem very strange to us. But it doesn't seem strange once you understand this structure, where this woman's physical and economic provision in old age depended upon her having children who would take care of her. And so they make provision, if a woman can't have children, for her to have children of surrogate mothering. So Rachel said, and verse 7, and Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. So Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have indeed prevailed. And she named him Naphtali. She sees this as a victory over Leah. Boy, I got sis this time. I've had 2 sons. She hasn't had a child yet, but she's had 2 sons, you see. Okay. I just got one up on Leah. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Poor Jacob, I'm telling you, talk about high expectations on this guy. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, how fortunate. So she named him Gad, which means good fortune. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, happy am I, for women will call me happy. So she named him Asher. Now, I think for the average woman in the 20th century, it is almost impossible for her to slip back into a mindset like the one reflected by Rachel and Leah here, isn't it? I mean, we just can't understand Leah being ecstatic because she still hasn't had a child. But she has had a child. She has had a child in the sense that is important for them, which is to have someone that is treated as your son, that is responsible for you in your old age, and therefore gives you security in whatever the future holds. To her, that was far more important than just the feminine fulfillment of actually bearing a child. In our world, in which old age is rarely dependent upon our children, thank goodness, okay, for women today, the driving thing is to have my own child, you know. Yes, I could adopt, but I would feel more fulfilled if I had my own. You know, we run into that all the time. That's the driving agenda in the worldview that we have. But that's not the primary frame of reference in their world, where survival is a much bigger issue. You see, we've got the survival issues taken care of. So we've got the comfort of dealing with a whole set of other issues. They were always on the stark edge of survival. And the survival of the clan and the survival of me in my old age was always a front burner concern. And so for them, the priorities in childbearing would be significantly different from what we're looking for by way of fulfillment and happiness and joy in childbearing. In fact, the biggest change in the modern world is that whereas in their day lots of children was financial advantage, we've now come to an era in which lots of children is a financial have, the less likely you are to be secure and get them through college. There's not much left for retirement. That's the bottom line. And so we've now just reversed the tables, where children are not a financial advantage, they're a financial disadvantage. Their world is exactly the opposite. Yeah?
I never thought of this. You bring it up like this. What relationship were these maids to Leah and Rachel from the beginning? Where did they come from?
They were slaves, bought from other clans, perhaps bought within the clan in some cases, people in your own clan, in your clan. If someone in your own clan, what would lead to your being enslaved would normally be poverty. You would come to owe somebody so much money you couldn't repay it, and there were no bankruptcy laws. If you owed a man more money than you could pay him, you just became his slave. And so if a man's family went into slavery because of his debt, and that's what happened. It wasn't just the man who went into slavery, the whole family went. If a man's family went into slavery because of debt, Normally, in that world, they would not enslave within the clan. They would sell that family, in effect, to another clan, so that the embarrassment and the stigma of them being slaves among their own brothers and sisters would not be theirs. So whether these people are Semitic, Egyptian, we have Hagar, Abraham's concubine, who is what? An Egyptian woman. She has been bought by Abraham as an Egyptian slave to take care of his wife, and then she ends up being his concubine. Other maids were taken in war. You know, somebody raids you, you raid back, you destroy them, you take their herds, you also take their women and their kids. What happens to those women and their kids? They almost always become source of these women who served as handmaids. Many times you just found yourself in a situation where you were not in bankruptcy, but you had more kids than you could take care of, and there was no way for you to utilize them in the building of wealth. And so daughters tended to be sold as slaves in the ancient world far more quickly than men. And this was true not just in the Middle East, it was true in Rome, it was true in Greece, that lower class people, and what I mean by lower class is anyone who's not in the aristocracy, the people who are below the aristocracy tended with some regularity to sell daughters into slavery because they simply had to have the money in order to hold the household together.
We're hearing some of these low-income, low-level countries these days kill the extra daughters because they just have not a chance to keep them.
What happens in Alaska to this day among the Eskimos if a tribe's food supply dwindles to the point that they can't survive? You know what happens? The oldest members of that tribe go get on an ice floe and float away, because that clan is on the edge of survival. See, the thing that you can never overlook is that we're dealing with a world in which everybody lived at the edge of survival all the time. There are no great philosophers, no great theoretical scientists in this culture, because survival is a daily challenge. You know, the rains may come at the right time this year and we have plenty of foliage. If the rains don't come at the right time next year, we're wiped out. You're one rainy season away from starvation all the time. And in a world like that, or a world where you're one walrus hunt away from the village dying, in a world like that, your values toward human life and human rights and human privileges are considerably different. And what you will always find in survival communities is that individualism is frowned upon. You've got to have a fairly stable, prosperous society before you can start advancing the rights of individuals. Because a survival society can't afford that luxury. You've got to have people who fall in line, take orders, give up whatever privileges they need to give up so that the clan survives. And anyone who doesn't do that is a different mindset. But I tell you, if you took us and you threw us into a survival mode, you would find that we would very quickly go back to that same way of operating. Human culture at the survival level operates that way. We simply have the comfort of not being compelled to do that, and so our values are built on a different structure. You had a question a moment ago, or comment?
Well, Job, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were both, but I didn't know they were the exception rather than the rule.
Were what? We're wealthy, that's right. What you're dealing with, interestingly enough, in these situations we're familiar with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, is you're dealing with people of considerable wealth. By their standards, these were billionaires. For instance, one of the reasons you know this, he was the personal guest of the Pharaoh. Powerful nation that the world had ever known. If there was a nation in the ancient world, it was Egypt. And at the time that Abraham was there, Egypt had existed as an international power broker for 1,200 years. It was the dominant force in the world. You be my personal guest. The only people who got that privilege were people who were people of means and clout. So Abraham was an extremely wealthy man. Interestingly enough, one of the other things we discover when we follow these ancient cultures is that only wealthy men could afford to take a second wife. Because when you got a wife, what did you have to do? You had to pay the dowry. And so only wealthy men had the means to pay for a second or third dowry. That's why, because it was a mark of prestige to be from a family in which there was enough wealth that there could be 2 or 3 wives. That meant that when you were among other women, you were noted as coming from a family that was very well heeled, because your husband was in a position to have 2 or 3 wives. Now, how many women would think about it that way today?
The case of Solomon.
Case of Solomon. Solomon has all these wives, which is really a different situation. What Solomon has are political wives. He probably had sexual relationships maybe on a wedding night with most of them, but probably never again had much dealing with them sexually or as members of his family. This is a very common practice. What Solomon does is a very common practice in the 2nd millennium and the early 1st millennium BC among powerful, fast-rising monarchs. And here's what you do. If this man over here is coming to power, and I'm afraid that he's going to be my adversary, I will go to him and I will say, why don't we form an alliance between us, and I will take your daughter as my wife. What she becomes is my hostage. See? Now then, before he goes to war with me, he's going to remember that his daughter's just down the hall and I can slit her throat anytime I want to. What these political wives become is glorified hostages in the ancient world. Okay? That's what they are. They're glorified hostages to assure that he's not going to turn on me, that I can depend on him in an alliance. That's putting it in its crass terms, but if you study how it played out, that's what they were. They were glorified hostages. So Solomon's a special case. He did have a number of wives he obviously had sexual relationships with, as did David, but a number of the wives that were in that train were just people who were part of the entourage of this political struggle. Well, a couple of other things, and our time is gone. Let me just touch on them real quick.